In November 1942, an armada of 850 Allied ships mounted the first amphibious landing of World War II. Here in North Africa, the Germans came up against a formidable American army and faced defeat for the first time. Heinz Oberger was a member of Rommel's Panzer Army Africa. This is where he would meet the enemy, on the battlefront. In 1942, with the German military machine advancing across the globe unchecked, the Allies decide on a confrontation in French North Africa, where Field Marshal Erwin Rommel reigned supreme. Under the terms of its armistice with Germany, the Vichy French in Africa must fight off any such invasions or face retribution in France. The Allied objective is to block Axis occupation of these French territories and set up Allied bases for operations against Italy and Germany from the south. Called Operation Torch, it's the first major amphibious landing of World War II. In London, Lieutenant General Dwight D. Eisenhower supervises the complex arrangement of air, sea, and land forces. The landings are set for November 8th. Eisenhower decides to restrict the landings to Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers. A shortage of landing craft and aircraft carriers precludes a more extensive plan.
Many of the U.S. infantrymen which were in Operation Torch had been training since 1940. There were then large-scale amphibious exercises held on both the Pacific and Atlantic coast of the United States. This was all being improvised. No one really knew how to make a large-scale amphibious invasion, and especially one of the size of Operation Torch, where many of the troops would come not from a base in Europe, but direct from the United States.
The reason for Hitler's success in North Africa is the Panzer Corps, which had been formed 2 years earlier. At that time, Heinz Oberger is a non-commissioned officer in the Panzer Army.
Die Italiener hatten in September
1940, the Italians crossed the Egyptian border and they advanced about 80 kilometers into West Egypt. In December, the British went on the defensive under General Wavell. In a relatively short time, they broke through and threatened Tripoli. Hitler said we need to prevent an Axis member from an impending defeat, and he ordered the founding of the German Africa Corps. Later, we became an elite group. At the beginning, it was just normal soldiers who joined. We began the transfer to Naples and Brindisi, and from there we were shipped to Tripoli. We dreamed of palm trees and savannas, and we were deeply disappointed when we arrived in a landscape that consisted only of sand. Palms were a rarity, and water was short. When there was water, it was salty. We had little opportunity to get rid of our disappointment because Rommel, who was named leader of the Africa Corps, immediately ordered the march to the east to prevent further advance of the British. Surprise attacks, British General Wavell said, he is sly as a fox and we have to watch out for him. And since that time, he had the name the Desert Fox.
After controlling North Africa for 2 years, Rommel's crushing Panzer unit is in for a series of major losses. At the end of October, an armada of 350 warships and 500 transports secretly heads out to sea from various ports in the United States and Great Britain. Their rendezvous, a point 4,000 miles away off the North Africa coast.
Once at sea, the men were told their destination was French North Africa, and that they were hoping to land as liberators to the French and not as adversaries. Much of the education, there was talk on board ships about being good to the local people, much of which being very political correct, even tended to show the population of North Africa as being composed basically of saints and noble people. Some of this was indeed aimed at creating good results to the troops and preventing hostility from the local people.
In transit, the troops hear an important announcement on the loudspeaker system. They're told that British General Bernard Montgomery and his 8th Army have succeeded in breaking through the German lines at El Alamein. It's a huge victory for the Allies and a disastrous defeat for Rommel and his proud Afrika Korps. November 8, 1942, the American fleet sets off the coast of Africa. But the big question in everyone's mind is how much resistance will the French collaborationist army give them?
In Morocco, the U.S. encountered its strongest opposition. The French Navy, the battleship Jean Bart, engaged the U.S. Navy battleship Massachusetts. U.S. Navy dive bombers had to be used against French naval attacks. On the ground, French-Moroccan troops put up for several days very strong resistance against U.S. forces on the ground until an armistice could be agreed to. The U.S. troops which went into Operation Torch were all green. They had never seen action before, while the French which opposed them were relatively poorly equipped, not set up for modern warfare. In many places, they encountered very strong resistance from the French.
Operation Torch overwhelms the French resistance. Algiers surrenders on the first day, but 2 British destroyers are sunk in its harbor. At Oran, fighting is stiffer. The American 1st Armored Division is decimated by French Marines, and 2 destroyers are lost. As for Casablanca, the battle takes 3 days before there's a surrender on November 11th. Several French ships and 1,000 Frenchmen are lost. Admiral Jean Darlan, second in command in the French Vichy government, personally orders a ceasefire in North Africa. On November 13th, a treaty with the French is signed. The North African territory is now under Allied jurisdiction. Although French crowds welcome American troops, there's reason for the soldiers to be skeptical.
The French saw the Allied invasion of North Africa not as liberation. In contrast, when the Germans moved into Tunisia soon after the Allied invasions, the French military in Tunisia did not resist the Germans, but rather withdrew from the crucial airfield.
Rommel builds up his strength for a decisive counterattack, landing more than 1,000 men a day. The Tunisian ports of Bizerte and Tunis form a defense line for the Germans. But Allied planes bomb the newly arrived forces. Now comes the real battle. American troops clash with well-trained panzer units.
The U.S. Army was first introduced to World War II-style mobile warfare at Kasserine Pass. At the Battle of Kasserine Pass, a quick-moving German counterattack defeated a largely scratch collection of American units from the 1st Infantry Division, 1st Armored Division, other units. These were pushed back from the Kasserine Pass. This was a key pass in the escarpment between Tunisia and Algeria. By pushing them back, the Germans laid open the possibility of a counterattack towards the plains in Algeria, imperiling the Allied lines of communication.
For American tank units trying to establish superiority, bloody battles lie ahead, as well as a lesson in humility for the Desert Fox. The German reaction to the Anglo-American invasion is instantaneous. By December, the Germans pushed back the British First Army on its approach to Tunis. Strong American forces and even some newly allied French units move up to support the British First Army.
Winter of 1942 and 43 in Tunisia and Algeria was very difficult. Rain, mud, mechanized forces ground to a halt. Storms washed away bridges, washed away roads. Airfields became seas of mud. Aircraft couldn't operate. So the chances of a quick victory after the landings in Torch, in taking Tunisia, were in many ways prevented by weather. Once the troops came ashore, they moved to the front line in Tunisia by the French railway. Little boxcars left over from the First World War. The U.S. used what they could to bring their forces up towards the front in Tunisia.
The 1st Armored Division moves into the desert, an environment they're unaccustomed to. On February 14th, with the Allies well stocked with supplies and Rommel running out, the Panzer Army is under pressure to attack.
For the first time, we encountered American troops, and these soldiers were not only inexperienced in desert warfare, they were inexperienced in warfare. When they came from the US, they suffered greatly in the first few weeks due to this fact, whereas we could fall back on our 2 years of experience in desert warfare. The weapons were constantly covered in dust, and they had to be cleaned if they were to work at all. Added to that, there was generally a great shortage of water because the few wells that existed were used up very quickly, and one couldn't remove the salt to the point that it was suitable for human consumption.
The Allies are caught by surprise and have to fight a series of delaying actions. Hill by hill, valley by valley, they are driven back.
The U.S. had to learn modern warfare in Tunisia. The Germans had been doing this successfully against the British since 1941. And the fact that they were only able to do this against the Americans one time at Kasserine Pass really shows how quickly the U.S. Army was able to learn these lessons.
Although the Germans are beating back the Americans, their fuel and food are running low. Rommel's requests to Hitler for help are not being answered.
Tunisia saw for the first time the German Tiger heavy tank committed to combat in the West. These were much larger, more powerful than the Sherman tanks, designed and built in the United States, that equipped the bulk of both British and American armor. The Tiger had an 88mm gun, very thick armor, and it was very difficult to destroy.
Rommel continues his push, threatening to cut the Allied armies in half. To plug the gap at the strategic Kasserine Pass, 2 American divisions speed eastward from Iran. Thousands of trucks hauling all important supplies are a major factor in the battle. The weather clears, and 104 American aircraft heavily bombard the German lines. By the end of February, Rommel retreats to the Mareth Line, a system of fortifications built by the French before the war. This is his original position at the beginning of the battle.
Actually, the biggest problem we had was the shortage of water. We were allowed 1 liter per day. Of that, the field kitchen got a ½ liter, so we only had a ½ liter to drink.
While Operation Torch forces race in from the northwest, General Montgomery and his 8th Army strike the Mareth Line from the southern flank.
Fortunately for the British, they had ultra signal decrypts. They knew where the Germans were positioning their forces. The British had also been able to build up supplies, which had lagged behind during the pursuit after Al Alamein, and were able to hook around through the desert and outflank much of the Mareth Line. So guarded by most of the German strength in Tunisia, the Mareth Line did not block the Allied advance.
On the 26th of March, resistance along the Mareth Line is broken. The Germans begin to retreat. On the 7th of April, the Americans link up with the British 8th Army. The trap is springing shut on Rommel. The last great assaults begin, with the Allies gaining the upper hand.
Tunisia ended with very hard fighting. The objectives were the 2 key seaports of Bizerte and Tunis, for which the Germans supplied their forces and at the end tried to evacuate them. German army on the defensive is always a formidable opponent. The Germans and their Italian allies, once they were unable through counterattacks to throw the Allies back from the borders of Tunisia, put up strong defensive locations along hills, would mount local counterattacks, interlocking fields of fire from machine gun. Even if they were outgunned by the Allies, their use of light artillery, mortars, to pin down attacking infantry, made most of the British and Allied attacks very costly. Rommel's powerful reputation was part of the Germans' effectiveness. George Patton took over the Second Corps, which was the main U.S. strike force, and he said, I'm not going to be intimidated by Rommel, and the U.S. was able to make sure that they did not develop a complex about Rommel being an invincible general.
By now, there is no alternative left for the Germans but to give up.
In the spring of '43, we were disappointed and angry at Hitler because he didn't send us any supplies. The only thing he sent us were orders to Rommel. You can lead your troops into victory or defeat. We had nothing left for victory, so the only thing left for us was defeat.
On May 7th, Tunis and Bizerte fall to the Allies. The German collapse is now complete. On the 12th of May, it's all over. 250,000 German and Italian soldiers have been taken prisoner. On May 20th, 1943, a gigantic victory parade is held in Tunis. Heinz Oberger is not present. He has been wounded before the surrender and returns to the Axis ally, Italy. Operation Torch is over. It is the first step in a long campaign which would eventually see the Allied forces push back the Germans to their own borders and break the Nazis' grip on Europe.